It was a long-awaited blueprint for conquering Ontario's deficit. To help us examine how the province's deficit busting has been going and where it will go in the wake of the prorogation of the legislature, here are Michael Proulx, who was the finance critic for the Ontario NDP and the MPP for Beaches East York; Peter Sherman, finance critic for the Ontario PC Party and the MPP for Thornhill; Mike Schreiner, leader of the Green Party of Ontario; Diane Francis, editor-at-large for the National Post; and Martin Regcon, who's the Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star. And it's good to have all of you around this table this evening, and I just want to start. You watched the interview with the Minister of Finance, Peter Sherman. Start us off. Reaction?
Well, I think the minister believes his own nonsense, but he is part of a government that has brought Ontario to the brink. And you don't have to believe me. You can believe S&P, the rating agency that is now threatening the possibility of yet another downgrade, remembering, as he must, that every point in interest that we pay is $500 million additional dollars, and interest is already the third largest thing we pay after health and education. He's also part of a cabinet that is behind the prorogation of a legislature at a time when Ontario can ill afford it.
Michael Proulx.
He is the total king of spin. As I watched him here tonight, he's talking about all the wonderful things they're doing, about how he's shaving off the budget. He's running the largest budget deficit of any single person in the history of Ontario. He's talking about so many things that are so completely not true. I think if people believe his spin, then I feel a little bit sorry for them. But we have to take everything he says with a grain of salt, because he is. He's trying to say that the Liberal Party is doing things that they are not doing, and that it is literally impossible for them to do under his watch.
Mike Schreiner.
I think the Liberals are going down the wrong track, and essentially what they're doing is they're recycling old ideas from the 1990s that aren't going to work, essentially attacking public sector workers and gutting public services. And if you go back to the Drummond Report, I know we're going to have that conversation tonight, his report was about reinventing government and reimagining how government could work in the 21st century to protect public services, to enhance public services while still maintaining the sustainability of our finances. And the Liberals are failing on that. And moreover, they've actually failed to tackle some of the big ticket items which you brought up, the fact that we're borrowing $1 billion to subsidize people's electricity bills by 10%, which is essentially a tax cut for the rich, and actually undermines our efforts at conservation, which is only going to cost us more money because then we have to put more money into new generation. Going down the wrong track.
Diane Francis.
Well, as a business writer, I think this is terribly disappointing. The political culture of the Liberal Party is very disgraceful. I mean, first of all, they threw all kinds of money to buy an election, to cling to power. And then the CEO of the party, i.e. the Premier, who spent our money, the shareholders' money in the way he did, doesn't like the outcome, so he's quitting a year after he sought his office, and leaving us with a handcuffed opposition, a frozen government, and suppression of democracy. I think it's pretty disgraceful.
Martin.
Well, that's almost unanimity. I'll dissent only in one area. I think they have some recognition, as we all do, of the problems that we're facing. I think it's easy enough to diagnose those problems. What we should try to figure out tonight, or hear from all of our guests, is what the remedies are, and try to find some way, some path forward. You have different opinions at the table. The second question, though, is even with the plan that they have, do they have the ability now to go forward with it? You heard Mr. Duncan say that he is considering a leadership race. If he takes himself out of contention, out of the Treasurer's office for the next few months, who is running the store? That's a long period of time before the next budget. It's unclear to me, whatever happens next year, election is inevitable early in the year, in the spring probably. It's unclear to me whether the bureaucracy, the machinery of government, and the political leadership will be able to move forward on any plan, whether or not you like this plan.
We should just explain that, because, Peter, what the Premier has said is if you want to run for the leadership to replace him, you've got to quit your cabinet job. Does that make sense to you?
It doesn't make any sense, and I've never heard this before. What it means is that the continuum that he wants to maintain, while he doesn't have a legislature in place, which is bad enough, he would maintain with people who have no experience in the job, or maybe have experience with another portfolio. And when you listen to Dwight Duncan, in your interview, say that he wants to come to a conclusion with the public sector unions, for example, or maybe he wants to negotiate with my party, which I have yet to see any signs of, to come to a wage freeze agreement, he's going to step down when? Next week? And who are we talking to then? We have no idea. So no, it doesn't make sense.
Well, you've said no signs of. The day the Premier resigned, he's, gave a pretty strong indication that he's looking to the PC caucus to help him out.
Well, then let's have a sit down and let's do it. There are certain circumstances under which my leader has said we're prepared to talk. He's talking about being prepared to talk. The only talks I've had with Dwight Duncan are about being prepared to talk. The rules of the game are you have to have a legislature. You can't legislate without having a forum for debate.
Martin?
Can I be helpful here, though? There has been some time over the last few weeks, an opportunity where the legislature was sitting, where the Tories and the Liberals, absent the New Democrats, because they have their own position, which they defend, which is not to legislate and not to really freeze in an aggressive way public sector wages. But there was an opportunity over the last few weeks for the Conservatives, Mr. Hudak, Mr. Sherman, to have some kind of an interaction with the Liberals, and I haven't seen any strong evidence of that yet. Does that mean that the Tories are now off the hook for the next few months and that they need not come forward at all? I'm not sure. I think there's an opportunity, an opening for reasonable people like Mr. Sherman and Mr. Hudak to come together with other reasonable people.
Well, I would hope,
on
Martin,
this issue.
that we're not off the hook, quite frankly. People keep asking me, wow, look at all free time you've got. I haven't had any free time at all, and I don't expect to have any, and I would hope to have to work hard on this kind of a file. But the bottom line is that there are rules of the game that have to come into play. You notice in the interview, Steve, that you did, that there was very little reference to the fact that of the entire budget, which comes to $120+ billion,
$26
$55 billion are salaries. The biggest single exigency of this finance minister and of this government is to resolve, if they want to have any hope of whenever the next election is of even competing, they have to control that. They've said it, we've said it, we all agree on it. The bottom line is he's not making any moves in the right direction because there have to be conditions that permit this kind of dialogue. You can't give us what passes for draft legislation, which even by their own admission winds up being a bill that's more holy than Swiss cheese.
Michael Prue, let me follow up with you, because the reason the Premier has said he needs to break bread with the Conservatives instead of the New Democrats, with whom he got help to pass his budget, was that your party will absolutely, positively, categorically, unequivocally not entertain the notion of wage freezes for salaried employees of the Ontario government. Are you putting him into a corner?
Well, I don't know that we're putting him into a corner. We think that the BC Supreme Court put him into a corner many years ago when they said that this kind of action is illegal and will not be sustained by the courts. We know full well that the first day that they instituted Bill 115 against the teachers, they said they were going to the Supreme Court, and they've gone there. I mean, it is unconstitutional. The Canadian Civil Liberties has said that it will not meet the test. Why would the New Democratic Party want to go down that route when we know it's going to cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars in the long term?
Because Duncan says it'll require 20,000 education workers getting fired if it doesn't work.
No, I think that's not going to happen. If you look, the teachers back in April said that they were willing to take a 2-year wage freeze. The teachers back in April said that they were willing to work with the government to cut $20 million out of the administration. They said they were willing to work with the government to get more younger teachers hired and less old-timers sticking around. All of the things that the government wanted to do, but the government was bound and determined to look more Tory than the Tories in order to win a by-election in Kitchener, and it didn't work.
Mike Schreiner, let me pick up on this with you. We know, of course, that as the Premier was resigning, he decided to prorogue the legislature at the same time. What kind of an impact does that have, in your view, on the attempt to do all of what we've been talking about tonight, manage the economy appropriately, get deals with teacher unions, et cetera, et cetera?
It slams the door on it, and I think the prorogation of Parliament, it shows contempt for the legislature. And one of the critical things the legislature does is pass laws, review legislation, hold the government accountable. And let's get to the real story here. The heat was being turned up on this government based primarily around the gas plant fiascos and their inappropriate way in which they've handled that whole situation. And to me, this was a use of proroguing Parliament that put partisan interests ahead of the public interest. And I don't think that's right. And I think it's time to get the legislature back to work so we can address some of the big challenges economically, environmentally, and socially we're confronting.
Okay, Diane, give us the business perspective on this, because I've heard...
I think that, politicians get lost in their own nonsense and narratives. with all due respect. This is a abrogation of management responsibility. A cabinet is a board of directors. A premier is a CEO, chairman of the board. They have walked away from making a mess. They've run a corporation into the ground, 8 years, 5 years of losses, 1 year after the other, gone crazy with spending, increased taxes, and now they're just walking away and leaving the mess. If the teachers had agreed, as you said, to a wage freeze, why didn't they just freeze the wages? That should have been done, that could have been done. Instead, we don't have the wages freezed, even though the teachers appear to be reasonable, and there's a problem in taking it to court anyway. And he just walked away. They walked away from it.
But I find it shocking. I've often heard business people say that they actually prefer it when politicians do less so that they don't screw things up more.
No, but we're talking about running a corporation. The most important corporation in Ontario is the Ontario government, and the management has walked away for 3 months, and nothing is going to be done for 3 months.
Well,
they've abrogated. Yeah, but there should be questions asked about what they're doing and who's really the finance minister, and we don't know. And this is, it's a mess.
Well, Martin, help us out with this, because I get questions on this from Twitter and Facebook and all that, who people wonder, did the Ontario government just shut down? Is nothing happening at all? What is happening now?
The bureaucracy is still at work, 56,000 people, but the bureaucracy needs political direction to know where it's going. There's still a premier in charge with some years of experience. It's not like he's a newbie. But it's true that some of the senior cabinet ministers, if Mr. Duncan steps down, will be absent with leave in this case. Look, I want to just...
Martin, can I also say, too, from our point of view in the media and the shareholders are not able to get questions properly asked about the gas plants and everything else that's going on. So we're treated like mushrooms. We're shut out.
With all due respect,
that's not right.
With all due respect, both to the politicians and my friend of long standing formerly in the Toronto Star and now in the business press, I don't think the corporation model works. I don't think he's a CEO. I don't think it's a board of directors. I think we are voters and we live in a democracy. And while it's absolutely a wrong turn to prorogue the legislature for such a long period of time under such weird circumstances.
If I can interject.
That's suppression.
Hang on. Let him finish his point, then Peter.
I do think that there is still an opportunity, number one, for the Tories to show where they would go. The New Democrats have pretty much said we're going to leave this alone and people should just have conversations. That doesn't work in the business world when people are having labor management negotiations either.
Management teams don't quit.
I've spent a long time in the business world.
Let me just quickly say on teachers, it wasn't that easy. Everyone here in various degrees likes to sometimes pay fealty to Mr. Drummond. Mr. Drummond didn't say just freeze wages. He did point out that the teacher's grid, I hate using that word, but the pay scales for experience and education also had to be looked at aggressively. And that's where the negotiations bogged down. And let's not forget, there were deals with 2 of the other teachers' unions.
Martin, with respect, you're acting as an apologist for this government. The bottom line here is that the analogy that Dianne Francis gives of a corporation and having been a CEO and run a corporation for many years is as logical an analogy from a public perspective as you could possibly have.
Especially from a conservative, I agree.
Well, from a conservative or anybody else.
Not a conservative apologist.
This is about the business of government, and this is about the expectations of the shareholders, and the shareholders are 13 million people here in the province of Ontario, and they haven't gotten a good deal, and now they're being told that they're going to get a worse deal. Let's look at interest. Interest right now is pushing on $11 billion a year that we're paying, the 3rd largest single expenditure in the Ontario government period, with a big threat coming from credit rating agencies that we're not going to be able to continue. We're pushing on 8% unemployment. We have 600,000 people, men and women in Ontario, who want a job and can't get a job. Because why? Because we're not making the conditions in this province fertile for business. And so we've got a government that is walking away. And it's like a CEO saying, you know what, I can't do it, so screw it.
And yet, Michael Prue, yet, he has hit his deficit target so far and says he is on track to meet his deficit targets going forward.
Why was he targeting deficits?
Has he? I mean, if you look, the first thing I did is, and you have the book right there, open to page 84 and 85, and you will see that he's running a $13 or $14 billion deficit this year, and next year he's bound and determined to take it up another $1 billion, and the year after that he's only down $1 billion. I mean, he's saying he's running 3 years of deficit in the $14 to $15 billion range. I don't think he's hitting any targets at all. And, you know, what he is doing is he is putting us further and further into bankruptcy. I don't want to sound too much like a conservative, but that's that is where he is taking it. And let us not believe his spin on this, that it's slightly better and it's all on target. It's not on target. I don't know of any other government in the history of this country that's ever put that many deficits together in a row and said we're on target.
Can I add a footnote
and
to
that?
That?
Deficits of that magnitude
My footnote is that if you take a look at the business model, you've never met a sales manager who doesn't undershoot on his revenue estimates so that he can create expectations and then overperform. I can tell you that with Dwight Duncan, he creates deficit figures that he knows he's going to attain. Then when he comes in at $500 million or $1 billion better, he pats himself on the back. Come on, we're talking about a guy who's patting himself on the back for essentially losing $14.4 billion. Give me a break.
Mr. Sherman, let me introduce you to Jim Flaherty, the federal conservative finance minister.
We're not talking about
Jim
Flaherty.
You said you had never met a salesman of a company that had ever overshot, underscored, etc. The point is, Mr. Flaherty and the federal conservatives, not your party, your progressive conservatives, has consistently said that his budget deficit would be lower than expected, and then missed his targets. The complete opposite of Ontario. We're having fun with
I'm not going to do a push and shove on that, but the bottom line is, I could see missing targets for Flaherty or for Duncan if it were one time. This is an MO for Duncan. He does it every year, every time.
Let me get Diane and then Michael Prue, please.
Yeah, I mean, we have a political class, and it's all parties. It is absolutely a problem. Well, you haven't been in power yet. We'll just wait for the Greens, who brag about losing less money than they thought they would, and they make sure that they can lose less money than they thought they would. That's like a CEO saying, "Oh, great, we did really well. We were supposed to lose $1.5 million this year, but we only lost $1 million. Thanks very much." And I think the business analogy, the metaphor, is not only a common sense way to look at it, but to not get caught in all the verbiage and everything, because they are good at spinning. Everybody's good at spinning in the political world.
You would acknowledge there's been a great recession, and the government did have to borrow record amounts of money in order to prevent people from going off the edge.
Yeah.
You would acknowledge that.
Yes.
So what's the problem then?
The problem is they spent more money. They spent twice as much as the GDP grew by, going back all the way before the recession happened. And you know, that was just not on.
And if you want to use the yardstick,
I promise Michael.
Ontario is 5th in terms of per capita money that we're taking in, but we're 9th, just slightly ahead of PEI in terms of our economic performance. Only Prince Edward Island has a worse record than Ontario. I don't think it's anything that the finance minister should be proud of. If he were to take us from 5th place to 1st place, or even from 9th place to 5th place, you know, in the middle of the pack, I would think that he might have done something. But the reality is that we are the 2nd worst province in Canada in terms of our per capita expenditures and how we are dealing as a province.
Is it a coincidence that the two governments you've identified are the only two Liberal governments in the country?
Well, no, I think it goes hand in hand with liberalism.
Michael, all right, go ahead.
Can I just quickly say, so that we don't descend into a warm-up act for the Romney-Obama debate, why are we looking backwards so much? It's fair enough to say that deficits have gone up. There is a stimulus argument. But I think that the challenge that we all face as Ontarians or shareholders, voters, and the political classes, as Diane calls you, is what are we going to do going forward? And Mr. Duncan has put forward a plan before the McGuinty resignation, and I think one of the interesting challenges is also to riff off of the Drummond roadmap or blueprint. I wouldn't call it a roadmap.
Let me pick up on that.
What do we do next?
Stand by. I'm going to pick up on that. Michael Schreiner, you get the first digs at this. Here's Carol Gore in the Toronto Daily Star, who writes the following. If Premier Dalton McGuinty had listened to Don Drummond, he'd be in better shape than he is today. He warned McGuinty to avoid 3 tactics that sound useful but are often harmful. The first was a temporary wage freeze for public employees. It might improve the balance sheet for a couple of years, but the moment the freeze ended, there would be a surge of pent-up demand, making it harder than ever to put spending on a sustainable track. The second was legislated wage settlements. They would achieve poisoned labor relations and made it harder to achieve lasting gains. The third was across-the-board cuts, which Drummond called an abdication of the government's responsibility to make tough choices. McGuinty ignored his advice. He made across the board in every department, except health and education. He imposed a wage settlement on Ontario's public school teachers before they had even taken a strike vote, and he left overstaffed agencies and costly election commitments intact. That's Carol Gore's take. How do you think he's done at implementing the Drummond recommendations?
I think Carol Gore is bang on. That's what I meant earlier when I said this is recycling old ideas from the 1990s that didn't work. I'll make 4 quick points. First of all, the teachers did come to the table with a wage freeze proposal. And that would buy the government some time if they would have actually agreed to it and negotiated, but they refused to.
The government said it wasn't a pure wage freeze. It allowed people to go up the grid, and that's an increase.
But you know what? You can freeze the top end of the grid, but I think it's wrong to freeze the bottom end of the grid for
Teachers
the low
agree with you.
for the low end for the people who are just entering the workforce. Second point is that they missed the biggest ticket item in there, which was the fact that we're borrowing $1 billion to subsidize electricity prices, and that's wrong. The third one isn't in the Drummond Report, but it's an important point, is that we've now had an education crisis under an NDP government, a conservative government, and a liberal government, and for whatever reason, all these parties with the teachers. We had rate A's, we had Harris cutbacks, and we have liberal cutbacks. No one at Queen's Park is willing to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the fact that we fund two separate school systems in this province.
Two public school systems.
Catholic and public. We could merge those two together. The estimates are we could save between $1.2 and $1.5 billion, create a fair system so we don't fund one religion at the exclusion of the others, and save money that we can reinvest back into the school system.
Peter, will
and the fourth point is we have failed to talk about the revenue side of things. We've only focused on spending. We've got to talk about the revenue side. Two quick points. One is creating jobs. We have to stimulate local job creation to boost tax revenues. And the second point, which Drummond did talk about, is let's start looking at polluter pay principles so we can earn revenue for the valuable natural resources we have in the province.
Lots of follow-ups there. Peter Sherman, will the Conservative Party in the next provincial election, which could be next spring, run on a platform which would include defunding of the separate school system and creating a unified school board in the province to save how much money? 1.8 billion?
1.2 to 1.5 billion.
No.
Why not?
We haven't even begun to consider that. We've got so much work to do before we get to some of the nitty-gritty of that nature that it's not even worth the discussion. You talked about Drummond. Drummond put out about 360 recommendations. Drummond, more important than the recommendations, and this is exceptionally important to anybody watching us tonight, is there were instructions with those recommendations. You take them in concert, and you wind up avoiding a $30 billion deficit by 2017 and a $400+ billion debt, which is unsustainable for the province. They didn't do it, they cherry-picked them. As far as we're concerned, we would have taken the other part of Drummond's instruction, which was, you have 360 recommendations. If you're going to take something off the table, let's take full-day kindergarten as an example, you put something back on the table. In other words, you have to make the math work. That's what's happened here. So it's not a question of separate school boards or any of that. It's taking a look at some of the basics. We've put out white papers. An example would be getting rid of layers of bureaucracy that are unnecessary, like the LINs.
Local health integration networks.
Local health integration networks. You could take a look at a variety of other opportunities through the 600+ agencies, boards, and commissions that exist under the Ontario government.
How much would that save?
That would save billions of dollars, but we can't tell at this point. We know it's billions. Here's what we do. We would eliminate the ones that aren't working, and there are so many. We would fix the ones that are broken, and we'd keep the ones that actually operate.
Okay, let me go to Michael Proulx. Michael Proulx, I remember once upon a time you ran, I think for the leadership of your party, pledging to defund the separate school system and create a unified school board.
No, I did not pledge that. What I pledged was an opportunity for the New Democratic Party to debate the issue. It had been held, back, and no one was allowing it to come forward onto the floor to be debated. As a result of my candidacy, although I did not win, the NDP set up a commission to go out and look at that. There was cross-country or cross-province discussions, and at the end, the NDP determined that there was not enough political will to proceed with that
but
at this time.
Are you personally for it?
Well, I think that the economic argument is a strong one, but also the emotional argument that many people have to their special status in a Catholic school is also strong. It's something that has to be weighed. I think that governments are singularly unprepared to do that. I heard the Conservatives aren't willing to do that. My own party says the time is not right. The Liberals say they're not going to discuss it, and only the Greens are I guess, at this point, saying that. But I think it is an important issue, and as Ontario matures with more and more people from all parts of the world, with more and more religions here, it is an issue that someday is going to come to the fore. There's even a case in the Supreme Court of Ontario as we speak today on this very point.
Could I ask you, who cares not much about touchy-feely constitutional issues, but is very deeply engrossed in the bottom line, whether it's worth $1.2 billion for educational peace to have two separate publicly funded school systems, or would you create just one?
Well, I've never understood why we divide our children along religious lines from the time they're little tiny people. I think that's ridiculous.
For 144 years.
But it is a tradition. It's a B&A thing. It's a French-English thing. It was the trade-off. The Brits left us with this. I think that it is a conversation that every province has to have. You know, they did it in Newfoundland. Even in Quebec they did it.
Absolutely.
And they turned it around. So, but we have to have that conversation. So it's something that we can waive, but I think it's enshrined.
This is why Ontario is not a business or a corporation with a CEO and a bottom line. This is politics, it's compromise, it's religion, it's all the things you don't discuss at the dinner table, but you discuss over here on television. Look, the NDP, thanks to Michael, did put together a very interesting internal report on merging the two systems. I recommend it to all of you. I've read it. It's a fascinating and beautifully written document. And it puts to rest the myth that it was easy in Newfoundland, or that it was, or that it is something that Quebec is a model for Ontario. There was so much fallout from the merger in Quebec. They had such a different dynamic with English and French considerations at play that we don't have here. So it's a non-starter. It's something the Green Party can talk about along with a carbon tax, both of which I might support personally, but I recognize that the voters of Ontario don't agree. Either a carbon tax, for various reasons, neither does Mr. Sherman's party, neither does the NDP, nor do I think that this kind of merger would happen anytime soon. As for Drummond, I think there are some myths that have developed around Mr. Drummond. The idea that a pay freeze was something that need not be done. It's true that he has spoken many times in public in his report that an artificial pay freeze creates pent-up demand. Don't do that. However, he said, you are hurtling towards a $30 billion deficit if the economy slows down, if you don't do something. You need a pause. You need some breathing room in order to undertake the kind of transformation and reformation that people have spoken about. He did say, as an economist, not a politician, that it would be preferable to have a negotiated settlement.
Which the prorogation presumably allows for. We'll get to that in a second. You wanted to say.
I wanted to say that a wage freeze is something that my party has stood square for since before the last election, and we still do. And it's not to penalize any one particular group. If you're talking about the penalty box, everybody in Ontario has undergone some form of a wage freeze, notably in the private sector where most people are employed. I certainly have as an MPP, and not complaining about it, for the past 4 years. The bottom line is that the ask here is simple. Look, unions, give us some breathing room. This saves $2 billion a year. This is a significant amount of money. Let's get on with it, do this thing, and in 2 years, it's not about pent-up demand. We'll pick up where we left off, and we'll start negotiating reasonable contracts with you over the fullness of time. The bottom line is we're looking at the here and now, and the here and now says, under the aegis of austerity, a government said we're only going to spend $2 billion more this year than we did last year, the budget year we're now in. Now they're projecting they're going to spend $4 billion. So there is no austerity here, and we have to find some savings somewhere. This is a great place to start.
Okay, Michael Prue, I know nobody around this table likes the idea of prorogation, and I've heard from the people of Ontario who, through tweets and Facebook and emails and phone calls and everything, I haven't found anybody yet who likes this. Anti-democratic, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally.
We all know what the arguments are. However, and let me put this out there, this does give, in a somewhat lower temperature atmosphere, an opportunity for teacher unions and the government to come to some kind of an agreement that apparently heretofore was not possible. Is that right?
Well, no, I think it was really possible. I mean, the unions were all sitting down. OPSU, which is the largest provincial government union, CUPE, had already sat at the table and have already said they're willing to take 2 years of wage freeze. They want to discuss other issues that are important to them, part of the negotiating process. But in terms of actual expenditure of government money, they were willing to take 0 and 0 over 2 years, and they were rebuffed.
But teachers aren't the only ones there,
We're
Michael.
not talking about teachers. We're talking about the rest of the civil service with this famous white paper that you're going to get on board with somehow. You know, this is not necessary. It is going to do exactly what Drummond said should not happen. We believe that people of sound mind sitting together, negotiating a deal, can negotiate and do the best deal possible.
But Mike Schreiner, does the prorogation create a better atmosphere within which that can be successful?
I don't think so at all. I mean, governments have negotiated labor deals while the legislature sat across all political stripes over a number of years. So why can't this government, I guess they can't chew gum and walk at the same time here.
In fairness, it's a minority parliament. It's harder.
Well, it is, it's true, but still, it's even happened in minority parliaments. And the bottom line is, Michael's right, the unions came to the table with a wage freeze. I mean, the Green Party called for a wage freeze in the last election because we felt it was necessary as well to get our deficit under control. Obviously, the unions agreed. They came to the table. And if we're going to reinvent government, and I can say this as a business owner, you know, I found most of my efficiencies by working with my employees and saying, identify cost savings, help us identify cost savings. In this case, our employees have already come to the table and said a wage freeze. How are we going to identify the additional cost savings if we answer that with a sledgehammer and say, you know what, we're not going to negotiate, we don't want your wage freeze, we're going to legislate you?
If we're going to use the corporate analogy, which you like, sometimes CEOs decide they're going to shut down for a little while and go off and take a retreat out into the woods and discuss
Not good
things.
Ones.
Not good ones,
Not
eh?
efficient ones, not effective ones. If there's nobody to negotiate with and we have this hiatus, then what are the teachers to do?
Martin, is there an argument to be made here that the prorogation, never mind they've just let all those bills die, they've avoided the contempt, they've shut down the committees, never mind all that, does the prorogation create an atmosphere which might more successfully conclude with these negotiations?
Absolutely not. You won't get me to agree with that. Nice try. I think what we've seen over the last week and what I've written is that labor leaders, and thank you, Mr. Sherman, for not calling them union bosses, labor leaders were, I think, not as loud initially in criticizing prorogation. Why? Because they were having a bit of a back-channel dialogue that started just the week before in order to try and come together. There's been a bit of oversimplification from my political friends in the political classes here who make it sound easy to have labor negotiations. Look, OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, offered a 1 year 0%. They didn't offer 2. The teachers' unions offered 2 years, but they wanted some extra catch-up cost of living after that. And they weren't always at the negotiating table in good faith. 2 of those unions did reach a negotiation and did protect the younger teachers in the grid, just as you suggested. So a deal, that shows a deal could be reached. Now I know teachers will get angry at me for saying that, who are in the other unions, but I think there was room for a deal. So prorogation, I think, has backfired. I think if there was, they had been talking about this even before McGuinty's resignation, even before the gas plant thing blew up. No question, this was political and opportunistic. Okay, but I do think that labor leaders had initially hoped they might be able to make some progress on this. I think now there's been so much of a reaction to prorogation that it has poisoned.
Okay, 6 minutes left. I want to focus on deficit reduction. You hate deficits so much. How about we raise corporate taxes 2.5 points and use that money to help reduce the deficit?
I think it's got to be cuts, and I think it's got to be taxation. I really do.
What taxation?
You need a mix.
What taxation?
I don't know. That's up to the management team that's on strike.
Do you think corporations can afford to pay more tax?
If they have to, they have to. I mean, you're really talking about the health of the province. But I think you can have deeper cost cutting. I think that I really don't understand why the roadmap that Drummond put forth, that everybody says, including the finance minister, was a good roadmap. Why did they take a different route? Why didn't they just implement?
Peter Sherman, is there any room to raise taxes out there to presumably increase revenues to lower the deficit?
I don't believe so. I don't believe that this is the time to be talking about raising taxes. As a matter of fact, probably the main reason you can say that we voted against the budget that's in place now is because there was a refusal, because of a deal with the NDP, to continue with the corporate tax cuts that would make Ontario a more fertile place and where we could erase some of the unemployment that has dogged us, being tail end Charlie in Canada for the past 68 months.
So it's all got to come on the spending side.
Well, I think it has to, and I think that the catchphrase that we've used, and it's not a catchphrase, it's reality, is you have to freeze, which is your breathing room, you have to fix, which is what's broken, and you have to reduce, which is spending. And I think that we can do it. I think that with hard applied work we can do it. What we've seen on a consistent basis from this government, if I can use the family analogy, is you spent the family's income this year, and you're talking about that vacation we all went to the Caribbean in February. And you have a choice. You can either spend it and pay it off next year on the Visa card, or you can just hold the line and say, you know what, we're just going to have to put it off for another year. Dalton McGuinty always puts off for tomorrow what he can do today, and that's what has happened here.
Tell me one thing you'd cut.
Tell me one thing you'd cut.
One thing you would cut.
One thing that we've cut? We would follow the lead of Drummond, and we would never have allowed all-day kindergarten to go forward.
Well, full-day kindergarten's in. So you're going to cancel it now that it's in?
It's in, but we can take certain precautions to make sure that it doesn't go the full distance. But the other aspect of what you can cut, I gave you an example, the whole infrastructure on the medical side we can put into frontline care, which would be LHINs, local health integration networks, and CCACs, the community care access centers. There are a lot of things that can be cut, and when we start digging, every time we turn a rock over, we find something.
Michael Prue.
We saw the dangers of when the Conservatives cut back in the Harris days. We saw people dying in Walkerton. We saw all of those things. I don't think Ontarians want to go there. We don't think Ontarians want to go there. We in the New Democratic Party think that there has to be a combination. There has to be a combination, as you said earlier to Dwight Duncan, of additional revenues and cuts in services. But in doing that, the NDP is focusing on job creation. We want, instead of giving out big checks to every single corporation that puts the money in their pocket and doesn't spend it, and there's trillions of dollars here in Canada right now exactly in that. We want to reward those corporations that spend the money on research, on hiring people, and we want to give tax incentives. We think that is the way down the future. That is the way to stimulate the economy. That's the way to keep people back to work.
So a tax break if you create a job.
Tax break,
but
yes.
Corporate tax increases as well.
If we need to.
HST increases?
No, we're not big fans of HST. It's not a progressive tax.
Income tax increases?
If necessary, for those who can afford it. I'd like to take the Obama thing and say for those who can afford it, yeah.
So your floor is where? 250?
Look, I can't get into that. I really have. I don't have the army of people that Dwight Duncan has to advise him where the exact tax point is.
Okay.
It was us who said $500,000 to begin with. We would look at other places, but we have to balance the budget. You cannot keep a budget sustainable at $15 billion year after year in deficit. Can't be done.
Mike Schreiner?
So why'd they take the biggest cut off the table, which is $1 billion subsidizing energy prices, which is essentially a tax cut for the wealthy, because they're the biggest energy users? Why aren't we talking about stimulating revenue through job creation? And there's also resource revenues that aren't carbon taxes, Martin. I sat through the Aggregate Resource Act hearings, and even the aggregate industry came to the table and said, we would pay higher fees if it meant less cutbacks to the Ministry of Natural Resources. So there are opportunities in industries like that. I think of water taking, I think of logging, I think of mining, I think of aggregates. There are places like that you can generate some revenue.
If that Ring of Fire goes forward, do you think that's a big payday for the province? I mean, should they really be sending the tax rates through the roof in order to realize some revenues on that?
Well, first of all, they need to have proper land use plans in place before they even put this thing in place. They need to have agreements in. They need agreements in place with First Nations. They can't send 40% of the processing offshore, and they need to build a rail line to actually ship the stuff.
Yeah. The last 30 seconds goes to the Toronto Daily Star.
The reason that the government brought in that goofy energy rebate that you keep complaining about is because these two parties kept saying they wanted to cut the HST, and they did that in lieu of that. The reason that people keep talking about Drummond is that he did in fact want more integration of the healthcare system, not less, as Mr. Hudak is suggesting. What my friends here haven't talked about cutting is horse tracks. We have so many in this province, far more than any other comparable jurisdiction in the U.S., and neither one of the opposition parties wants to cut that. So when it comes to actually making concrete plans and balancing the budget, I agree that we have a deficit that is a serious problem.
Martin,
but
we got to
go.
go.
Politics is too hard.
We all want to go watch the debate. Let's go. Okay, Michael Prue from the NDP. Thank you for coming in tonight. Peter Sherman, the PC finance critic, thank you. Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, thank you. Diane Francis, editor-at-large for the National Post, thank you. Martin Redcon, the Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star. We took the Daily out some years ago, didn't we, Martin?
Yeah.
We did. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.